Hi everyone, and welcome to our revised video lecture for week 3. Please note that the learning objectives have been altered from before, as the prior iteration of this module was based on a different yet related reading. Some of that content is included in what follows, but you should be using these learning objectives to frame your discussion forum post. But before we get into this week's historical content, I have two preliminary issues to discuss. The first is conceptual. Recall our learning objectives from week 1, in which we outlined the 3 overlapping strategic phases of settler colonialism and compared them to Lemkin's 3 categories of genocidal techniques. Here you see an outline of this correlation, whereby confrontation corresponds with physical genocide, so on and so forth. This is also followed by a brief description under each relationship, as well as the pertinent weeks in our syllabus. As you can see, weeks 2 and 3 fall under the confrontation/physical genocide category. And down here at the bottom, you see a fairly broad description of what we mean by physical genocide. However, just like the 3 strategic phases of settler colonialism are not necessarily linear or mutually exclusive, so too are the boundaries between the 3 main categories of genocidal techniques porous and indistinct. I'll come back to this point later. But my other preliminary point is methodological. As Ben Madley argues in his article this week, we have to refocus the American genocide debate away from this large-scale, macro-level, all-or-nothing approach. That was really how the debate was framed when it kicked off in the 1990s, after the Columbian Quincentennial in 1992, when you had some scholars arguing that there was a single massive genocidal process across the entire continent over the past 5 centuries, and other scholars arguing that there was no genocide at all. Such a framing invites an overly simplified binary response. Either yes, there was a genocide, in the singular sense, or no, there wasn't. Now, that's not to say that the macro-level approach is unhelpful. The Shatter Zone framework from last week, for example, adopts a more macro-level perspective. But it does so while also remaining sensitive to the uneven and diverses of colonialism and genocide in North America. Even in regions like New England, here on the left, and California on the right, there is an enormous diversity, both culturally, politically, and otherwise. So once we start moving down to this meso level of analysis, at least we're able to focus on particular regions where we can be more specific in terms of geographical and temporal parameters. And as far as your case study assignment is concerned, this is a suitable level of analysis. Although, if possible, you can try and drill down to the micro level of analysis, focusing on a particular tribe, such as the Pequot, here on the left, or the Yuki, here on the right. Micro and more specific and localized, capable of identifying specific points in time and space, where conditions for genocide are realized by actors on the ground. Now, these multiple levels of analysis are not mutually exclusive, as it's possible to move between them, albeit with an understanding that they make different types of claims. For grand, generalizable claims, whereas the micro is for more specific, particularistic claims. Regardless, following Madley's advice, the question of genocide in Native America should be primarily answered at this local level. Madley also proposes a comparative methodology that is based on 4 indicators of genocide, which you see listed here. How does Madley use these categories of analysis in his case studies on the Pequot War in colonial New England during the 1630s and the extermination of the Yuki in California during the 1850s? And to what extent do these indicators correspond with the definition of physical genocide noted earlier? How might we need different variables to explain other categories of genocidal techniques? That is a key question here, as it's important to understand how Madley is deploying the concept of genocide at its sharpest, narrowest end, primarily focusing on mass murder, largely at the expense of other broader techniques of group destruction. What's getting left out of his analysis? For example, let's look more closely at California, which is the primary subject of Madley's research as well as the basis of my prior video lecture, as I used to assign portions from Madley's monumental book-length study. So, like the rest of the continent, we see a pretty spectacular demographic collapse of indigenous people in the period of Spanish and then Mexican rule from 1796 to 1848, and then during the early period of American rule from 1846 to 1870, when there was altogether about a 90% decline in less than 2 centuries. By 1880, census takers recorded just 16,277 Californian Indians. Disease, dislocation, and starvation were important causes of many deaths. However, abduction, slavery, mass death and forced confinement on reservations, homicides, battles, and massacres also took thousands of lives and hindered reproduction. Madley is remarkably exact with its figures, estimating that American settlers killed about 16,000 Californian Indians during the period of 1846 to 1873, and probably more. Yet, as we can see, that was just a fraction of the total deaths during the period of American rule. So why such a narrow focus? This law's decision to use the UN Genocide Convention as an analytical lens. As you've probably gathered, I'm pretty critical of using the convention as a definition, given its politicized background, and I instead favor the much broader conception provided by Lemkin. Besides, I don't think that social scientists must be committed to legalistic standards of evidence and reasoning. As I've suggested, the problem with such a narrow focus is that it leaves out so many other forms of violence that contributed to the process of group destruction, thereby missing the bigger picture. At the same time, however, there may be good reason for using the convention as a definitional standard. What rhetorical effect does this have, insofar as the official legal meaning of genocide can be used as a means of persuasion? Is there an analytical trade-off between scope and focus, between breadth and depth? That is to say, has Madley sacrificed his analytical scope by honing in on the most explicit forms of genocidal violence? And to what ends? Is it more convincing to focus on the sharper end of the destructive spectrum? Okay, the following few slides are old content, and even though they pertain to California, I still want to breeze through them to make some general observations. Prior to U.S. settlement in California, the Spanish-Mexican system tended to use Indian laborers. Early American settlers continued this trend, at least flux of American settlers following the gold rush and the subsequent admission into the Union. Now, recall Patrick Wolf's argument about the need for labor as a restraint against eliminationism, and the difference between saying, "You, work for me," versus "You, go away." With the rapid influx of settlers, the need for indigenous labor quickly diminished. The rights of indigenous peoples were explicitly denied in the state constitution of California, which in turn led to the erosion of moral boundaries, thereby generating a climate of impunity. Thus, the general idea here is that discrimination and the erasure of legal protections serves as an important risk factor for genocide. There was a broad anti-Indian consensus among white Anglo settlers, which altogether generated a sense of impunity, a social climate or environment in which anti-Indian violence was permissible. This facilitated the rise of paramilitary groups, or irregular armed forces that carry out acts of violence on behalf of the state but still beyond the purview of state control. Across the continent, these privately organized military forces tended to follow a typical pattern. As settlers flooded an area, subsequent ecological changes disrupted indigenous subsistence patterns, leading to the theft and killing of livestock, which in turn led to the rise of settler vigilantism, with settlers often responding with indiscriminate and disproportionate reprisals. This escalatory dynamic provided a justification that tended to camouflage or sanitize genocide in the historical record. Finally, let's turn to our reading by Osler, who shows how extirpative warfare became a policy option against Americans. In fact, there was a debate during the early Republic over how best to deal with what the Declaration of Independence referred to as the merciless Indian savages. In the immediate aftermath of the American War for Independence, one option was to simply pursue military operations against the Indians and crush them into submission. Obviously, it's investment for a cash-strapped fledgling government. Thus, the more practical option was to push for land cessions, or negotiated treaties in which indigenous peoples would sell their lands to Americans and move westward. This principle was evident in the 1787 Northwest Passage, which regulated American westward expansion and contained this provision regarding Indian affairs. Note the crucial caveat, which meant that warfare was a concrete policy option for dealing with indigenous resistance against American pressures for more land. On the flip side of this, also consider how an indigenous consciousness of genocide may indicate the presence of genocidal intent. Note how Osler uses native voices to register the threat of extirpative warfare. What kind of evidence is he using? And what exactly does this evidence speak to? Okay, and that's it. If you have any comments, questions, or ideas, let's talk about them on the discussion forum. Anyways, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.